Welcome to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. It's a podcast that amplifies the voices of people with multiple chemical sensitivity, or MCS, also known as environmental illness, chemical intolerance, and toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, or TILT. The podcast also highlights emerging research about the illness. I'm Aaron Goodman, host and founder of the podcast. This is episode 20, and the title is Snowflake, Arizona. It features a conversation with two longtime residents of Snowflake, a town in the northern part of the U.S. state of Arizona. The community has gained a reputation among people with MCS as a relatively safe place to live, away from chemicals found in urban environments. You'll hear Susan Molloy and Scott Killingsworth, who live in Snowflake, talk about their experiences with MCS and settling in the community, what it's like to live there, and some of the challenges, including the climate, and the steps that people with MCS normally take in order to decide if living in Snowflake is the right choice for them. You'll hear a bit of an echo when Susan and Scott speak, and it's because they were at Scott's house in Snowflake during our chat. He's sensitive to chemicals and all kinds of paint, and so like many people in Snowflake, he's covered his walls with tinfoil. Doesn't have any soft furniture in his living room like a couch, and the floors are tiled. I hope you enjoy the conversation and find it of benefit. We release new episodes twice a month. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It's a great way to help others learn about the podcast. And find us on social media. Just search for the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast or Podcasting MCS. Leave your comments about anything you hear on the podcast, and please share the podcast with others. The podcast is also available on YouTube, and you can read closed captions in any language you like. You can also support the podcast and help us continue creating greater awareness about MCS. Find a link in episode descriptions at chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Get in touch. Just email info@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. And thanks so much for listening. Well, Susan and Scott, I want to thank you so much for taking time to speak with me on the podcast. It's great to connect with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
I wanted to start with asking both of you about the onset of your illness. So if you could take the listener back to when and where you were living, what were you doing, what were you experiencing at the time when you first started to develop symptoms of multiple chemical sensitivity, environmental illness?
I was 27 years old. I was a graduate student at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and I had an office and was working one day, and there had been an infestation of termites in that part of the building. So the department that I was in, psychology, hired a company to come spray for termites. And I had grown up, our family used pesticides. It just wasn't a big deal. I didn't think twice of it. So I sat there, the guy came in and sprayed, and I got really sick, and even for weeks afterward, I tried to go back and work in my office, just thinking, well, it'll air out in a couple of days, but it never did. I had to ultimately move to a different office. And so that was my trigger. That was 1998. And it was actually that pesticide was banned in 2000 for any kind of indoor use. So a little too late for me and a lot of other people, but that was my trigger. And then it was kind of a gradual progression of getting worse, after that, to the point where I was disabled.
Thank you. And Susan?
I'm in my mid-70s, and I started getting symptoms of this disease, I think in my late 20s, probably. And by the time I was 31, which was in 1981 or so, I had symptoms that could not be denied at that point. They got real serious real fast, which was, in retrospect, that was good. It showed me that I had this illness, whatever it was. We didn't have a name for it in those days. That I was real sick, and the inciting exposures were very, very clear, such as mold food, indoor environments. You know how that goes, plugging in any kind of electronic devices. It all came on at once for me in the space of just a very few weeks. So I didn't have the opportunity to go into denial or to think, how am I going to bargain my way out of this? Or I wonder where there's a treatment. It was just, I got sick and it was time to go right away.
And when you say time to go, are you you're not referring to, are you moving to Snowflake, right? Because no, okay, so that came later, but at the time that both of you got ill, it's some time ago. Did you seek out any medical assistance? And if so, how were you met by healthcare professionals? How were you received by your people who you worked with, supervisors, family members, and others at the time in relation to the illness?
I'd say my medical care was pathetic. The first time I was taken to an emergency room with anaphylaxis, the doctor in charge of my diagnosis and treatment said a lot of very silly things. He did say that some of this was allergic in nature, and he gave me, what people give you, atropine and Benadryl and lots of shots, and then see you through till morning. That was great for a first aid treatment, but he did not understand what I tried to explain to him when I came around in the morning. It was very disappointing to me, but what are you going to do? You're grateful to be alive and get out of there. And that happened repeatedly over the next couple of years, that doctors they were not able to understand why I was explaining something to them that they knew was false.
When you look back at the onset of the illness in your case, was it a single event, or do you feel like it was an exposure to multiple toxins?
I think I had quite a number of exposures. They included, I found out many, many years later, Coxsackie B2N3 virus, which is credited or blamed for triggering ME in among British people and Australians. And I'd never heard of that, of course, but I'd never heard of any of this yet. At any rate, I had that virus. I spent about 3 years in tropical countries in Southeast Asia and Central America, and had numerous pesticide exposures during that time. And later, just a few years ago, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease and Ehrlichia. And I don't know what part, if any, of those played in contributing to a body burden. My diet was atrocious. I didn't take care of myself. I was in San Francisco, and it was an exciting time. And I stayed up late as often as I could listening to music. Most of the people I was around were smokers. And a couple of years ago, again, I finally had some diagnostic assistance later in my life. Come to find out, I have very, very serious celiac disease. And that's something that had never occurred to me. I had a genetic test done and inherited it from both parents. And that was revealing to me. Maybe some of the things I'd been eating since infancy had contributed to being prone to developing this kind of disease. At any rate, in my case, there were a lot of exposures. I can't blame any one of them. Not to mention also, I had lots and lots of vaccines and inoculations and gamma globulin and so forth when I was traveling and before I left the country. And I'll never know if that was a contributing factor.
I understand. Scott, were you met with the same sort of skepticism on the part of medical professionals? And feel free to talk about how work colleagues, family members responded, and if possible.
Yeah, so when I was poisoned in my office, I went the next day to the student health center, and they didn't really know much about, poisoning, pesticide at all. They just basically said, well, why don't you could call the Poison Control Center. So I called them, and they said, yeah, that could be a problem, a short-term issue, but you should be okay. And so, of course, I wanted to believe that. So I said, great, I'll be fine. But yeah, like I said, I became progressively more sensitive to more and more things. after that. It didn't happen all at once. We're talking really over a period of years. So a few years after that, I went to just my family doctor and I told her a bit about what was happening. And she was very nice, wasn't really skeptical, but clearly just didn't know anything about it and didn't really have much to offer. And then about a year after that, I went to a environmental doctor in Atlanta where I was living. And I don't know, she recommended some treatments that were all really expensive. I didn't really have a lot of money, so I didn't do them. And I never really did a ton of expensive treatments, which honestly, in hindsight, I don't necessarily regret because I think their track record is pretty mixed at best. And I didn't have the money to do it anyway. So, but as far as friends, family, colleagues, people were nice. Nobody really ever, I think they were skeptical, but they were, at least to my face, were, nice about it. Family's been very supportive, totally supportive from the beginning. So I feel very fortunate about that because I know that's definitely not always the case. My work was really supportive overall. They, even though I'm sure they had their questions or doubts about my illness, they were very accommodating. I was able to work part-time from home. And then as I got sicker, eventually full-time. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I had a much better path than some of the horror stories that I've heard from others.
You were a student at the time, I believe. Were you able to finish your studies? And you mentioned you stayed with your work for some time. And then what happened? Was there a point where the illness progressed when you made a decision that you had to leave? And you were also in a relationship at the time?
My girlfriend at the time, who was wonderful, but she was skeptical, I think. And I think it didn't help that she entered like multiple chemical sensitivity into Google, and most of the stuff that came up, at least this is 20 plus years ago, was skeptical. It was not favorable to us. So, she read that and, she eventually came around and was very supportive, but it's a hard one. I think that I remember seeing the 2020 piece that John Stossel did, I want to say sometime in the 90s about MCS. And this was before I had it. And I remember being skeptical and thinking, well, that just doesn't make sense. I've never heard of this. That can't be true. And so I just think that's kind of a natural reaction to something if you're not familiar with it or haven't had, some kind of exposure to it. So, I don't necessarily blame people for being initially skeptical. I do blame them for being nasty about it, or continuing to be skeptical after they've been better educated. But yeah, I was fortunate. I did finish my degree and was able to work for a company in Atlanta for a number of years. But yeah, I just got progressively sicker and sicker to the point where I would have some good days and just too many bad days where I wasn't productive and just wasn't able to do it anymore. So filed for disability in like 2008, I think.
Understood. And Susan, in your situation, did you also come to a point where you needed to make a change? Can you bring us back to that moment, if there was a moment like that?
Sure, there were quite a number of experiences of living for a couple of weeks on one or another friend's back porch in San Francisco, or they might let me sleep in their car. There were a couple of places I could go and be inside if I had the window wide open and if my face was right up next to the window. It was just homelessness and a lot of fear for me. At one point, some very dear friends decided that they would like to get help from me, and they were on the verge of doing an intervention, which would have meant I would have been in a psychiatric hospital, and people smoked in those days, and that would have done me in once and for all. So eventually I got help from some friends and got out of town, out of San Francisco, and went up to live in the mountains for a while. I have family there in Northern California, and I was able to stay in cleaner air and have a little bit of control of my food and things like that. That helped immeasurably. And then when I was getting a little bit of recovery, I realized that what was missing from our situation was accessibility. We didn't have, if I was going to have this illness and I couldn't go in any buildings, that had to be changed. Because at that point, it was starting to look to me like this thing could go on for years or maybe be permanent if it didn't kill me first. So I started working real hard on making a difference in naming what was happening for us. I thought, well, chemical sensitivities and environmental illness and so forth, that's almost a diagnosis. And what good does that do us? We're sick. And in those days, in the late 80s, early 90s, we just knew we were sick. And to me, it was more important to achieve disability status than it was to get whatever fantasy points people think that they get from being sick. So that became the thrust of my work from then until today. I think it's important for us to turn that political corner from being sick people to being people with disabilities. People with disabilities have legal rights to work and live places and go in public. And that's what I want for us.
Yeah, and you've been really a leader in terms of your advocacy and activism, and I want to thank you for everything you've done and continue to do. And I wanted to ask you both about the time when you first learned about Snowflake. Is it a community that you knew about for quite some time? How did you hear about it? Did you first go and visit with the intention of just checking it out, or did you, when you first went to Snowflake, did you go with the intention of moving there? What was the first kind of experiences you had with the community?
In about 1992, I was just finishing grad school at San Francisco State. I couldn't walk anymore. My speech was very slurred, and I couldn't take care of myself very well at all. And I was in a wheelchair, and it was just real hard to keep going any farther with my studies. So I stopped at the master's degree, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. I didn't know if I would get any better if I moved. I felt like I was already in a relatively clean living situation in Marin County, way up on a hill. I thought I had gotten my environment to be as good as it could get. I had a friend, a telephone friend, who I met through our support group system, who lived in Snowflake, and he had come here for clean air. And he encouraged me, if I ever got sick enough, to come down and see what it was like, see if I did any better at high altitude, dry, minimal vegetation, and so forth, in a remote rural area. And so eventually maybe I became frightened enough of my own physical condition and not knowing how to keep out of the grasp of social workers who were by then wanting to help me. They didn't think I could take care of myself anymore. I didn't want to get stuck in that trap. So I came down here to visit that friend, and I was real surprised. I get out of my car when I first came here, and I could stand up. I didn't need help. I still needed the wheelchair for several weeks, I guess, but not all the time. I wasn't falling all the time, and my speech was a little better, and I had a little better clarity of thinking. I went back to San Francisco, and it all started again. All the symptoms started when I got close to the city. I came back here to Snowflake again to double check my judgment, and sure enough, I was better. And I had no intentions whatsoever ever in my life of moving out to the desert in a rural area. I had grown up in a place a little like this, and I wanted to be in the city. I wanted to be around the music and the people and the quickness, but here I was. And I knew if I stayed in San Francisco, I would not be able to take care of myself, and I might not last that much longer outside of a nursing home. There was no debate for me. There was only one way to go, and that was to come down here.
When did you first learn about Snowflake, Scott? And was it a quick decision or a gradual process for you in terms of choosing to relocate from Georgia, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think an important point is that there was no Snowflake community when when Susie came out in 92, was it?
Mhm.
1992, nobody had a bigger role in creating this community than Susan Molloy, with her inviting people to come and visit and explore the area and encouraging people to build houses and just befriending people from all over the country and probably all over the world. So I think that's an important point, that this community would not exist, at least in its current form, without Susan Molloy. So I thank her, and I know a lot of us do. So I heard about it. I was part of the support group in Atlanta about 20 years ago for MCS. And so I heard about people talking about Snowflake kind of being the holy grail for us. So, several years after that, in 2006, I decided my health was really declining in Atlanta. And I thought, well, I better, explore some other options because I may just not be able to be here long term. And so I don't remember how I got her email, but somehow I got your email and emailed Susie. And I said, hey, I'd like to come out and visit for a few days this March. What do you think? And she said, okay, come on out. We'll see you. So I did. And it all worked out great, except there turned out to be an uncharacteristic blizzard right before I came. So there were probably 8 or 10 inches of snow on the ground, but I still showed up, and Susie couldn't have been more welcoming and introducing me to people in the community, introducing me to her dog, Blackie. Yeah, so that was really special. And just her warmth and hospitality, I think was a huge part of my ultimately being here. So after that, I went back, tried to make it in Atlanta for a few more years, but health declined to the point where I said, I've just got to get out. And I lived here kind of part-time in a travel trailer, like summers, for a number of years. And then I was able to buy a house in 2017. So I've lived here full-time, like 4 to 5 years now.
I wanted to ask you about the echo in the room, in the home. Now you're both currently at your home, Scott, right? And just for listeners, there is an audible echo, and there's an echo for a reason. And do you want to talk us through a little bit of why that is? And maybe later on, or maybe it's a good time to maybe describe your home.
Yeah. So, this is the home of someone really severe chemical sensitivity where I don't tolerate any paints, even the no VOC paints. So, or carpeting or wood floors can be really problematic. So this house, after I bought it, it did have painted walls. But I did what a number of people have done, including Susie, and I foiled the walls. I covered the walls with aluminum foil to provide the most inert, surface that I could come up with or think of. And it's completely odor-free. That's what it is. This house has tile floor. The walls are covered with aluminum foil, and I don't have a couch or other soft furnishings in here. So consequently, it is echoey, and so I apologize for that, but that's the reason why. And the foil is a little different. Wouldn't be my preference aesthetically, but I find that you get used to things pretty quickly, and especially just being able to live indoors and feeling healthier certainly helped me get used to it a lot faster. Also,
thank you for sharing that. When you first arrived in Snowflake, Susan, you arrived much earlier. You were the first resident with chemical sensitivity, perhaps, if I'm not mistaken. And then, Scott, you came years later. What were your impressions of the community at the time? If you met folks who had tinfoil on the walls, for example, or took other precautions, what were some of your impressions at that time of the community and of its residents? Maybe Susan, do you want to, because you arrived much earlier?
Well, I have seen a lot of people live through the process of being reluctant to come at all. They get bad enough, and then they finally decide, oh, what kind of news, we'll try it. And then some people are so put off by the isolation. We're about 12 miles out of town, and by the landscape, and by just numerous things. And then they realize, well, they might have to move here. And then they look around at the houses of people who've moved here relatively successfully. And it starts to look to them as though no matter how strange it might seem or look here, the way we do our houses and share certain kinds of chores and duties and so forth, it might look strange, but we're not sick here. We're not sick very much at all, unless there's a horrible air pollution event or something like that. We manage pretty well, and that makes it look a lot less strange.
Perhaps could you describe the community? You mentioned you're outside of the town itself of Snowflake.
Yeah.
You've talked about the geography, very high altitude, the desert. What does it look like? About how many people with environmental illness live in the community? Geographically, how large is it? And when you look out your front door, for example, your front doors during the day, what do you see?
House guests.
Yes, Susan hosts a lot of people. But a couple of things. So we're at 5,600 feet elevation. This is what's considered the Colorado Plateau. So I think technically it's not a desert. We get a little more rain than would meet the strict criteria for desert, but it's desert-like with not a lot of trees. And the trees that we do have are kind of sparse juniper trees, which aren't, tall trees that you might think of when you think of trees. So the community is, it's not any kind of commune, like nobody bought like a huge chunk of land and said, we're going to subdivide this out. Basically, Susie and several other of the pioneers here, bought properties that were contiguous to one another. And then since then, other EIs, people with environmental illness, have bought other contiguous properties, but it's not all contiguous. There are a couple of non-EIs kind of mixed in, and there are EIs that are further away. We're not all together necessarily. There's some in several other parts of town. So I think that's an important point, that people come here and they buy land and build a house. And, more recently, some of the original people who moved here have left, which has enabled people like myself to come in and buy an existing house, which was nice for me because it's a lot easier to start with a house than to start from scratch and have to build. In terms of numbers of people,
last time I counted people who I could find or who I could get my hands on if I had to, there were 41 of us, which that's a lot of people. And those of us who moved here early didn't mean to found anything. We were just trying to get out of town, and this was a place we could afford almost. It was overgrazed ranch land, and nobody really could think of anything else to do with it. The grass didn't even grow anymore. It was so destroyed by overgrazing. So we were able to pick up 40-acre parcels for really cheap. And that enabled us to stay here and have a little bit extra to share. And some of the people Scott mentioned who've moved out did that because they got better enough to go back to their old lives. A lot of the people who have moved out did so because they wanted to get away from the electricity. So they built off-grid houses that are much farther out into the country. Mm-hmm. And I should mention that we are in between Navajo Nation and the White Mountain Apache Nation. We're sort of tucked in between in our little town. And I think that's important, to honor that they were here long before we were. Yeah, nobody's lived here for hundreds of years since Native villages were moved out of here. We still find parts of their houses and pottery and tools and things throughout the area. Well, it's an honor to be here in that regard.
And the town of Snowflake is about 8 miles away, you said, I believe. And I looked it up, there's about 6,300 in that community, if I'm not mistaken. And so What kind of services do folks in your part of Snowflake outside of the major center have? Where do you do your shopping, your grocery shopping? Where do you buy juice if you want to go to the grocery store? If you need anything at all, you go into Snowflake, I assume, or do you have things in your own part of the community? And does going into town, if people do that, is that a challenge for folks with MCS?
It can be, yeah. And it would kind of answer the first part of your question. The best supermarket kind of in our area is in a town called Sholo, about 40 minutes from where we live here. There's a Safeway there that has a pretty decent organic selection. The town of Snowflake itself has a Walmart and an Arizona-based grocery chain called Bash's'. You know, they're okay. They're definitely more limited. We don't have a Whole Foods, a Sprouts, Natural Grocer, those kind of places in the White Mountain area, unfortunately. You know, hopefully someday, but for now we don't. Some people, you know, online is really a great thing in terms of ordering different, particularly non-perishable things. And some people make a trip, say once a month, to Flagstaff, which is about 2 hours away. And they do have all the big stuff, the Whole Foods, Sprouts, and things like that.
Do people who have MCS, environmental illness, in your community, does anybody work? Does anybody have jobs or go to school, etc.?
There's one woman who just retired from being a nurse. Her husband is the person who's hypersensitive in their family. There's another family with 4 children, and they're homeschooling their kids. There are quite a number of families and households where people have one member working and the other is at home and maybe helps more of the home chores. Also, I'd like to mention, in addition to what Scott said, we also have a service that is just wonderful. It's Azure Market, which is a co-op out of Oregon. And they do deliveries once a month. And we can order frozen food and bulk produce and then divide it up among ourselves. And the big things like the 50-pound bag of rice or whatever. And they're wonderful. They really help look after us a lot.
It's interesting to hear you talk about families because that's something that I wasn't aware of through my research about Snowflake. I was under the impression that it's predominantly folks who are single, but it's interesting to learn that there are some families. Yeah. And so you mentioned, Susan, that it's not like an established commune, but people do some activities or work together. How much engagement do folks with MCS have with one another? What kind of things do you do together, either to help keep things going or for social life, etc.?
It's kind of as much or as little as you want, which is nice. Everybody has their own house, their own land. There's no expectation of we're all going to meet for dinner every night or make anything like that, which I think overall for long-term living is ideal, especially with people with MCS we can have very unique needs and challenges, whether it's diet or, you know, whatever. So kind of having your own space, I think, is really important. But there are definitely, you know, opportunities to lots of friendships here, lots of opportunities to get together if for people that want to do more of that. And some people do and some don't. You know, it's just really depends on their personality and I think their level of health. Some people would probably like to get out and do more, but just aren't able to health-wise. You know, we typically have a number of parties every year where everybody's invited. Really haven't done that for a couple of years due to COVID. But just in the past month, we've had a couple, and that's been fun to do that again, and, you know, see people that you may not be kind of part of your normal group of friends, but you're still happy to see them.
Is there room for growth in the community? Let's say there are people listening who may have thought or maybe even considering the idea of exploring Snowflake as a place to live. What would you suggest for folks like that? And again, is there room for growth, or is there sort of a capacity? Can you reach a capacity in the community?
I don't think that there's a limit on how many people could live here. It's a huge area. It's zoned for the most part near us in 20 and 40 acre parcels, which gives us a little bit of leeway in terms of hosting visitors sometimes. What would be a typical course of events is that someone would come here in a van or a camper with their own cooking supplies and their own, the things that they need to the best of their ability. And they usually feel miserable from driving here. We expect that. We help them try to calm down if it's possible. And then they'll settle in for a few days and see what it feels like to them here. And the people who manage to make a go of it here are typically people who can face the problems of buying 20 acres and figuring out either how to truck in water or to build a well. And those are both challenging, but that's what people do. And there are prices that you pay for being out here. And we, those of us who are here have all decided or realized at any rate, those are prices that we have to pay to have a life outside of a nursing home and to feel good, to feel better than we would in the city.
Can we talk about the prices since you raised that issue? The cost of buying a home, is it relatively affordable if you compare it to a major urban center in North America and beyond? But I wasn't aware that there isn't running water, which makes sense. So that's an extra cost that people have to factor in. Is it an expensive place to settle in?
For us, it's expensive because most of us are on very limited incomes. But for people used to an urban area or a suburban area and the expenses that go along with living there, this is very affordable.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I've been rather disturbed by the increase in house prices, I guess, everywhere, probably in perhaps Canada too. I'm not really sure, but certainly here in the US, even in Snowflake. I mean, I saw in Zillow the other day that the average home in Snowflake is over $300,000 US, which astounded me because 5 or 6 years ago, it might have been like 140. So it's just shocking. And it really concerns me a lot because, a lot of us with MCS are disabled or otherwise have limited means. And so, anything that makes access to safe housing more difficult for people, I think is a terrible thing. So I personally hope that the prices drop back down, at least to some degree. I don't think of it as a good thing at all. We'll have to see, that's kind of a national trend that's out of our hands. But yeah, certainly, everything being relative compared to a major city, definitely is going to be more affordable than that.
Is there an option of living in a camper? And is there any rental housing available that's safe for folks with MCS?
We have 4 houses that were built as rentals for low-income people with moderate environmental sensitivities. They are absolutely not suitable for people who are exceedingly sensitive. They have helped a lot of people. A lot of people have come there, gotten a little better, and then moved on. That's the best outcome I can think of for those houses. Other people are still living there a dozen years later. Other than that, renting is a real problem. Very, very scarce. So if people aren't very self-reliant, that by which I mean having a trailer or a camper of some kind and probably a person to come along with them to handle things like chores and driving and interacting with the community in town, it's terribly hard. Like, no one who's extremely sick should assume that they can come here and that they'll be better and that we'll know how to take care of them, because it's the energy for that kind of thing is in short supply, and we don't really have more rentals than just those 4. I'd like to underscore that neither Scott nor I, especially I, we don't want to be advertisements for moving to Snowflake. That's just not the point. The point for us is if you can get portable before you go down too hard, move around and see what suits. Mm-hmm. If you have the possibility and the resources, and just see if there's any place else where you feel better. Mm-hmm. There might not be, but things go wrong here. There are controlled burns and there are forest fires, and those are, horrible events for anybody. We face those too.
Yeah, and not everybody feels great here. I mean, it's a different combination of pollens. It's dustier. If you're used to, if you're being in the east or anywhere that gets more rain, it's a very different environment, different climate, so some people feel good here and some don't. So it is important to kind of test, like Susie said, anywhere you're considering, because you just don't know. I know some people really feel good, like on the coast, and I don't feel good at all on the coast, but there can be real big differences between what's good for all of us. So the more testing one can do, I think the better.
So Snowflake isn't necessarily a perfect solution for everyone.
Oh, heavens, no, not at all.
And not at all because of the number of issues you've raised. It's isolated. The climate could be very different from what folks are used to. I wanted to ask, as we perhaps aim to wrap up our conversation, you mentioned controlled burns, and I think you mentioned climate change. We all know virtually anywhere the increasing numbers of forest fires and exposures to wildfire smoke. Has that been an issue for folks in your community in Snowflake?
Sure. During those days, some people will go camping someplace else, figure out which way the wind's coming and where the fire is and where it's likely to go. And they will get in their van or camper or whatever and go to a park someplace else. Some of us are a lot more likely to stay in, close up the windows and doors, turn on the fan, and just stay put. And I guess that's the same thing people do all over the West now.
Yeah, I think it's an issue for the entire Western US and probably Canada too. With climate change and the drying, warming conditions that we now face, it's likely just to get worse over the next 40 years. So I think that's a very important thing that anyone considering moving from east to west needs to take into account, that, yeah, you're going to have smoke sometimes. And if you're trying to get away from, say, mold in the east, you're going to have some smoke in the west. You may just have to decide which is worse for me, because there's just not a perfect place.
I always tell people to figure out, of all their options, which of the bad options are you able to tolerate? Because all the options are going to be bad. Moving is alarming and expensive. Staying where you are is alarming and expensive. Moving someplace and then having to move again is very expensive. So you don't figure on what's going to be the good option, what's going to work out really great. Because nothing will. You've got this disease, it's going to be like this for a while. So you pick the best of the options, none of which you might like.
I want to thank you both again. I think listeners are really going to benefit from hearing from both of you. So I want to thank you for everything you've shared. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
Godspeed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing this and for hosting us.
It's a total pleasure. That brings us to the end of this episode of the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. Thank you very much to Susan Molloy and Scott Killingsworth for speaking with me. The podcast is produced by me, Aaron Goodman, Rainey Novak, and Christy Eklund. We release new episodes twice a month. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It's a great way to help others find the podcast. And follow us on social media. Just search for the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast or Podcasting MCS. Leave your comments about anything you hear on the podcast, and please share the podcast with others. And some exciting news, the podcast is available on YouTube. You can listen and read closed captions in any language. You can also support the podcast to help us continue creating greater awareness about MCS. Find a link in the episode descriptions at chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. And if there's someone you'd like to hear interviewed on the podcast or a topic you'd like us to explore, just let us know. Email info@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. And thanks so much for listening.